So what's the topic of the day? Gas prices. We're not here to talk about gas prices today. We're here to talk about trying to get the best fuel economy out of your vehicle that you can. Stick around and find out how. First tip on trying to achieve maximum fuel economy. Going to avoid the Jackrabbit starts and stops. When you're accelerating away from a stop, as I did just back there, the tachometer, your goal is to try to keep it under 2,000 RPM when accelerating. While this isn't always possible in heavy traffic, you have people behind you, always try to make that your goal, is to never exceed the 2,000 RPM mark. Back up to 55 miles an hour, and I never exceeded 2,000 RPM. Alright, for the next tip, turn off your cruise. Yes, actually turning off your cruise can save gas in many circumstances. I'm currently on cruise, but I am also, look out front, on fairly flat ground. Now, when you're in the hills and you turn your cruise off and you're controlling your speed by your foot, you can control the input much better than the cruise control on the vehicle. For this reason, you have told the vehicle that you want to maintain a steady 70 or whatever mile per hour you have your speed set at, and it will do that regardless. It's going to downshift, it's going to accelerate, and it's going to burn more gas. If you will use the gas pedal yourself, modulate your acceleration up and down the hills, it will save gas. I want to do a little more clarification on what I was talking about exactly with the modulating the throttle with your foot instead of using cruise control. In the hills, as I said, cruise control will make the transmission downshift, it will add throttle input, and it will make your fuel economy go down. As you're approaching the hill, you're maintaining the speed. As you hit the hill, you actually allow the vehicle to do what is known in the industry as a droop. And the vehicle will actually slow down a little bit, okay? And you'll maintain the engine at the same RPM and the same speed, and you do not accelerate. You allow the vehicle to drop off in speed and climb the hill. Once you achieve the top of the hill, you allow the vehicle to coast off of the other side and to gain speed so that you will have a little more momentum to get up the other side. It's a learned practice. It's an art to do it. It's known in the industry as hypermiling. And I just checked what my vehicle got for fuel economy. I checked it with a calculator on the miles against the miles driven, and I checked what the computer said that the vehicle was getting. The computer said that I was getting 28.4 miles to the gallon. My calculations by fuel burn, because I just stopped and filled up, and like I said, compared it against the miles driven, was 28.4 miles to the gallon. So the onboard computer is deadly accurate at this point. How I achieved that was 90% of this trip, I used the gas pedal myself. I left the cruise control off because much of the way here, we came down through Mississippi and into Alabama. It's not like it's mountainous, but it is hilly. And every time the vehicle downshifts to get up and over the top of the hill, it burns more gas. So, like I said, I left the cruise control off. Once I made it down to the interstate, and there were a few places along the way that I actually was able to turn the cruise control on, It was flat ground with only minor inclines. So that is how I achieved 28.4 miles to the gallon. All right, for the rest of this trip, I'm not exactly sure what the topography is going to be, but I have a feeling that it's going to be mostly flat, and I probably will be able to run the cruise. So this is going to be a long-term test on this road trip to determine what the best gas mileage I can get with this vehicle. All right, so we've completed the 1,400 mile trip, and we achieved and maintained over the entire trip 28.4 miles per gallon. One of the other things that I did not mention earlier was one of the things that we did in order to hypermile more effectively and not drive other people totally insane that are around us, behind us, and all that, is we chose to drive on state highways. It's what some would call the road less traveled. Yes, it takes a little longer to go that way sometimes, but as far as the miles driven, it really doesn't add that many more miles, and it is easier and, in my opinion, safer to be able to pull off the hypermiling in that instance. So what I wanted to talk to you about today was some maintenance items on your vehicle to help improve fuel economy. So let me get set up and we'll talk about them. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about and discuss is tires and tire maintenance. First thing I want to talk about is cold tire inflation. Every tire manufactured that I have ever seen has a maximum cold inflation printed on the side of the tire. I have a lot of people that want to argue with me and talk about the safety of that, and there's a few other things, but let me just give you this before we move on. With the training that I've had, what I know about the tire industry and what I know about the testing and development that goes into producing a tire and the safety aspects of it, what they print on the sides of these tires has been tested for safety factors and for structural integrity of the tire. So, with all that said, let's move into what this says right here. The maximum cold inflation pressure for this tire that came on this vehicle from the factory says 51 psi. And in order to achieve a maximum fuel economy, you could theoretically run this tire at 51 psi. There are those that will say that you're going to highly accelerate your tire wear because they think that it is overinflating the tire. I'm not going to get into the tire wear issue and running your tires at maximum inflation. But what I will say about this is it's probably not going to accelerate the tire wear as much as most people think. This vehicle happens to be the 21 Toyota Highlander XSE. I actually have the display on the dash that tells me what the tire pressure is at each point on this vehicle. I just checked it a few minutes ago. It said that the right rear tire is at 32 psi. I suggest that most people go out and they buy a tire pressure gauge. This is the El Cheapoest tire pressure gauge. It came in a really cheap tire repair kit that I bought a while back. And when I say this gauge is cheap, it's cheap. This will be the first time I've ever used it. So this would be a good opportunity to test its accuracy against what the vehicle says the tire pressure is. So let's take a look. The gauge on the dash said that I was at 32 psi. And my El Cheapo, when I say El Cheapo, I'm telling you, man, this thing is cheap. It says 32 psi, so this gauge is probably pretty accurate. I would say to go get a digital gauge for the most optimal. Now, let's talk tire pressures. What I said a minute ago is that the cold tire inflation was 51 psi. no, I'm probably not going to run this tire at 51 psi. But I know in the back of my mind that I safely could, because that is what the tire is rated for. You end up compromising some of your cushioning and ride, but is that a fair exchange for increased fuel economy? I think it is to a certain degree. So I consulted the data tag inside the driver's door. The data tag inside the driver's door for the tire information says that these tires should be at 36 psi. That is the recommended minimum that these tires should be run at. I would probably, in order to try to maximize my fuel economy, would probably run 5 psi over that. And here in a little while, I'm going to take the vehicle around and I'm going to bring the tire pressures up to 41 psi all the way around. Now, let's move on under the hood. I apologize in advance for any background noise. It's springtime and it's time for the backpack blower to come out. Are you kidding me? Not kidding, folks. I mean, a crop duster literally just flew over my house. Directly over me. You can't make this stuff up. Another airplane. All right, my general recommendation for air filters, as long as you're not driving in dirty, dusty conditions, going off-road, driving on dirt roads regularly, is an air filter is generally good for, say, 2 years and approximately 30,000 miles, okay? I know there's a lot of people out there that every time they change their oil, they change their air filter. That's a little excessive. It's not really needed to be done that often. Now, I will say this. Now, if you are on dirt roads and driving in an off-road type conditions, yes, it's probably be a good idea to cut that time in half and go to once a year every, say, 15,000 miles in order to maintain proper airflow through your air filter. All an engine is basically is a big air pump, and it requires the right flow of air to mix with the right amount of gas in order to achieve the most efficient burn. So you want to make sure that your air filter is serviced correctly. And of course, the much talked about, keep your oil changed. There's a lot of speculation back and forth. People talk about it's okay to change at 10,000. Some say 5,000. Some say I'm not going to do anything less than 3,000. This all depends upon how you use your vehicle. Let's run over those scenarios real quick. If your vehicle is used on the interstate for long travel and 90% of the mileage is done on the interstate, changing your oil at 10,000 miles with the fully synthetic 0W20 that it calls for is perfectly okay. All right, so let's talk about the second scenario, which applies to my vehicle. We do take it on long trips occasionally. My wife drives it back and forth to work, and it requires her to be on the interstate for approximately 15 to 20 minutes. It's a ballpark. It is about a 30-minute drive commute, one way to work. So it gets driven about an hour in there. It is allowed to get up to operating temperature and maintain an operating temperature for an adequate amount of time. I'm going to go with 7,500 mile oil changes. With today's oil technology and filter technology, the way I use this vehicle, 7,500 miles is just fine. All right, so let's go to the bottom end of the spectrum. You have a vehicle that is seldom used. Say you're a retired person and your vehicle doesn't get used very much, and you're only, say you're driving 3,000 to 5,000 miles a year. On a vehicle like this, it is my recommendation that every 6 months that you take the vehicle in and get the oil changed, regardless of the miles, if your mileage is really low. Last friggin' airplane. What are we, in the flight path today? Seriously? All right, so let's cover the very last scenario. Let's say you're somebody who doesn't use your vehicle very often, and say you're And I saw this recently, somebody posted on one of the forums where they only drive their vehicle about 5,000 miles a year. Well, it's going to be my recommendation that you probably, regardless of your mileage, every 6 months, you go ahead and take your vehicle in and have your oil serviced. And here's why. You're probably driving short trips. The engine is not coming up to operating temperature. And this can lead to moisture buildup inside of the engine. In the previous two scenarios, the engine is run and operated long enough and held at operating temperature long enough for the oil to do what it's supposed to do, protect the engine, to lubricate, to cool. In the last scenario, where the vehicle isn't being used very much, the moisture cannot burn off. That moisture ends up mixing with combustion gases and ends up producing an acid, okay? And that acid can begin to attack internal components. So it is important to get the oil changed out regularly if you are not bringing the oil up to temperature to where it is designed to operate, and allow all moisture to be burned out of the oil. All right, so we're going to talk some Toyota specific information here for just a second. This is the 2GR FKS. On the newer model 2GR FKS engines, Toyota actually lowered the interval for changing the spark plugs. The interval for changing the spark plugs on this FKS is 60,000 miles. I've been on the forums. A lot of people want to argue and want to say, no, that's not right. It's 120,000. That is for the older generation 2GR. Now, well, let's talk about spark plug changes generically, as a general rule, okay, on most manufacturers. As I said just a second ago, the old generation is 120,000 miles. Most manufacturers today, and probably for nearly the last 20 years since they've gone to the newer style spark plugs, has been in the 100,000 mile range, okay? And most vehicles, I would say that is probably an accurate statement to say at 100,000 miles, change your spark plugs. Changing your spark plugs can have a direct impact on your fuel economy. Changing the front 3 spark plugs on this particular engine, there's nothing to it. The back 3 spark plugs, the intake manifold actually lays across the top of the other 3 spark plugs and requires a little bit of disassembly. It's not that difficult. If you've ever watched the Car Care Nut, he goes and he actually has a very good video. He actually shows how to change those back 3 spark plugs. It requires a little bit of technique, but it's not terrible. It's doable. So, all right, so I hope you found that this information has been helpful to you. This is most of the information that I have provided on maximizing your fuel economy can be used on any vehicle and can be used generically. There's a few things that I covered that are vehicle specific to the 21 Highlander, but most everything that I talked about today can be applied and used on any vehicle to maximize your fuel economy. We talked about driving techniques. We talked about turning off your cruise and controlling some of the acceleration yourself. And we talked about maybe taking the road less traveled. We covered tire pressure, and we went over some of the maintenance items that you need to look at and stay on top of underneath the hood to increase your fuel economy. Now, if this has been beneficial to you, please go down there and remember to hit the thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe. And thanks again for coming by the Real World Garage.